Hi there, I'm Doug. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Under the pen name of R.G. Taark, I wrote the Guardsman series. Today we're going through book number 3, that's this one, Wrath of Retribution. We're on episode number 38. This should be chapter 88. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy. Please give a like, share, and subscribe down in the bottom. Love to talk to you in the comments. Have a great day.
The Guardsman, Book 3, Wrath and Retribution, Episode 38, Chapter 88. Chapter 88. Persephone, that's the stupidest idea I've heard in years. Philip's fierce retort collapsed into a rolling barrage that stifled Seline's calming protest before she could voice it. He bowled forward, with his unbridled rage just below his words. What are you trying to do? Make us into one of those miserable core worlds, like Earth and their pedantic buffer sphere? Next thing we know, you'll have us all under dictatorial thumb with their absurd taxes, ridiculous overregulation, and societal theft. There is no way that I'm going to let you crush the entrepreneurial spirit of our hegemony for your little social engineering project. Persephone snapped back into the jaws of her father's tirade. This is a social engineering project. You're just being so thick-witted and irritable that you can't even see that it will actually be self-supporting and pay dividends to our society as a whole. We'll have a more educated workforce and greater productivity because there will be less need for childcare, which doesn't produce any marketable economic good or service. And it will reduce problems with juvenile crime because teenagers aren't out and about while their parents are working and unable to supervise them. So, we'll have less crime and more efficiency from both direct allocation of labor and eventual rewards from a better education system. So, don't give me any more of your pig-headed, I only know how to squish atoms together to make electrons, and that's the only business we should ever be in nonsense. There's more than one way to skin a cat or run a business, Philip Kroinos. The ferocity of Persephone's rebuttal set more than a dozen of their evening's guests back in their chairs, stunned on their plush cushions. Her use of his full familiar name was shocking in itself. The ferocity of her challenging words placed a huge exclamation point after them. The event was relatively small, mostly ranking corporate officers and immediate family. Persephone finally mentioned her little secret project for the first time publicly. It had never been discussed before, other than with Samson, and he told her she would get exactly this reaction. She decided it was going to be done semi-publicly where it had to be addressed once it was on the table. It became a matter of honor for her immediate family to address the issue in this setting, and she had known and counted on that. It basically amounted to a public challenge that needed to be quashed. Unlike public events where everything was scripted and carefully choreographed for the cameras, no protocol officers would have heart attacks over this outburst. That was reserved for the family and the absolutely top subordinate corporate officers to suffer those heart attacks. Samson hated the idea and had told her so. She didn't let anyone know, but she had picked her timing carefully. That part was obvious to Samson. The only people who moved at all were Tommy's 3 daughters, as they looked back and forth between themselves unsure of what to do, while looking more than a little nervous, as by far the youngest people at the table in a room full of suddenly tense adults. Celine scratched the side of her head with one finger. Samson kept his head down looking at his plate, mouth closed and back firmly plastered to the back of his chair to stay out of the line of fire. Philip was plastered to the back of his chair too, but instead of shock, wore chagrin on his face to match his hardened eyes. Philip growled diagonally across the table at Persephone. Girl, don't you dare think that you can disrupt my business model with your flight of fancy? Persephone instantly snapped back. It's not your business model, it's great-grandpa's business model. Philip convulsed with rage. Before Philip could flame her with a furious outburst, she powered along her prior track. And this has absolutely nothing to do with the Kronos generation business model. This is something completely different. So stop prattling for once in your life and listen. Philip's hand slapped white-knuckled to the table as he slammed himself forward against the head of the table. Prattling, I'm prattling now. Defiant daughter spat, Yes, you're prattling. Only the space between them gave her any safety from her father's now volcanic rage. With Samson to her left, a horrified Diantha on Samson's other side, and a shocked, speechless Reeves between Diantha and Persephone's father. Persephone fired her second salvo. Not only is my idea for a new school system going to produce a better educated student, it is cheaper, safer, but it carries substantial economic benefits from occupying students so parents can work. She fired the coup de grace. Not only all that, but I've already started doing it. Samson pressed the fingers of his left hand to his cheek and palm firmly over his mouth, preparing to ride out the coming storm. He knew for a fact what Persephone was playing would only fuel the argument, not end it as her last statement would have with anyone else. His wide eyes watched Tomies and his wife Abigail, who was directly across the table from Samson, exchange pointed looks. Tommy's 3 daughters, Sophia, Bridget, and Neola, continued to look silently back and forth at each other, communicating volumes in their shared looks. Samson envied the girls that they were the only ones still free to communicate with each other, be it silently since the confrontation began. The rest of the guests ranging around the table from the Chief of Naval Operations Admiral and the Support Command General, both of whom were CEOs of those corporations, and their wives stayed silent. The half-dozen subordinate corporate vice presidents and their spouses, who were senior enough to warrant invitations to the evening, also remained deathly silent. They were also smart and experienced enough to know that when Philip Kronos started this type of reaction, it was best to accede to his wishes. He was the boss. They pointedly hushed their husbands and wives when they began to form an input to the exchange. Philip snapped harshly through clenched teeth and throbbing temples. What do you mean you're already doing it? Samson saw that response coming. He suspected Persephone had been waiting for that opening now that he realized she set him up the same way in their tiffs. Selene injected calm sanity into the argument. That is an excellent question, Philip. Her input snapped Philip's head in her direction, derailing his thoughts. Selene pulled at Persephone with her words. Just what is it you mean by you're already doing it? Just how far have you taken this scheme of yours? Persephone was neither dissuaded nor cooled by her mother's interruption and unleashed on her too. She snapped, It's not a scheme. Persephone huffed in frustration. You make it sound like I'm robbing the corporate treasury or stealing from these kids. I want to enroll in my school. I'm doing nothing of the sort. I can subcontract the education responsibilities from towers and corporations, handle 100,000 students, and operate a 16-hour academic, athletic, and after-school study program. I'll double teachers' pay, increase academic standards, and still turn a profit from a subcontracted rate from what corporations are required to allocate to educate students. Selene sat back slightly shocked. Really? Persephone had not yet realized that she was not on the defensive anymore and snapped at her mother. Yes. Diantha leaned forward slightly into the peripheral vision on Samson's left side. He felt his eyes flick from the irate Persephone to the demure redhead to his left. She asked so softly that ordinarily she would not have been heard, but since the room was silent as a vacuum, she practically roared, Persephone, how do you plan on making that all work? The intelligent but very quiet newly minted head of the Citadel's personnel office naturally had an excellent mind for the logistics and finance of interpersonal business transactions. You're saying you would use subcontracted rates from the corporations currently running these programs. That is typically a 10% reduction from their collected fees. Are you saying you can make all that work with your system while giving 10% to organizations that are effectively referring students to your new school? How will you make enough money on your school to support space rentals and faculty? Samson reflected that Diantha's talents and beauty were completely wasted on that overbearing and abusive prick Casimir. Samson was suddenly re-impressed with her intelligence and foresight, digging quickly and deeply into the heart of the matter that had taken him several days to grasp under Persephone's calm instruction, even though he'd been sworn to secrecy about it. Samson looked at Persephone, but carefully remained silent, as Persephone blinked across him 3 times, while processing her newly minted and adopted sister's questions. Persephone smiled slightly at Diantha before happily launching into the details of her new favorite project. We systemically allocate a little over 7,000 credits per student per year for education in our current system. We all know the credits for education come from the sale of power to the towers and are dispersed to the corporate bodies to provide for education. Samson realized that Persephone had just sent a quiet dig at her father by describing a utility sales tax to fund social programs like the Core Worlds Philip had just railed against. It was a perspective he'd never seen before either, but Persephone was far too clever to have let something like that slip her tongue without prior planning. She continued unperturbed, I can take a 6,400 credit education subcontracting arrangement as long as the contracting corporation provides the transportation for their contracted students. That would be a requirement for acceptance of the subcontracting role. I can make a profit of over 15% per year on education and pour all that back into improving the school's systems and physical plant. As Persephone's overview trailed off to silence, both Celine and Tomes blurted their shared shock. 15%. The investment rivals shared their disbelief at the unheard-of profit of a venture. The two had been playfully battering each other for years in their competitive investment rivalry. Both were extremely happy with portfolios that grew at 7%, since most years they grew between 2 and 5%. It was almost unheard of for an independent corporation in any of the hyper-competitive corporate empires to profit more than a few percent every year. Business cycles, innovation, and competition hammered their margins and forced price cuts and other maneuvers to stay competitive. Persephone was talking about doing it on a sustained basis, which was unheard of outside of a protected imperial dynasty's corporate monopoly. The reason the imperial dynasties were tolerated was because they provided for the common defense in the form of the ground and naval forces, education, and often some form of vital infrastructure. Those corporations managed to balance those budgets by either collecting some form of tribute or selling a universal service like Kroinos Generation's electricity. Those credits were applied to every member of the society through their employers or the power meters to the buildings where they lived and worked. Persephone grumbled in return, well, nearly 15%. Her triumphant father barked a laugh and scoffed at Persephone. Ha! You're equivocating already, and you say I'm prattling. Persephone fired back angrily. That's only because I'm buying the whole damn building in the first year of operations, and I'm amortizing renovations in the second year. The physical plant and renovations will be paid for by the 24th month of operations. Everything after that will be poured into expansion and improvements of the system. Philip growled back at her challenge. Girl, that's all nonsense. There is no way you can pay for all that. How you plan on doubling working wages for teachers is just absurd. They already get paid 25 credits a day system-wide. You're talking lunacy. Persephone snapped angrily. It's not lunacy. I've factored it down to the janitors and licensed security guards and secretaries and principals who are needed to support the teachers. and I'm going to pay them twice what everyone else is paying." Abigail looked from her stunned, silent husband across the table to Persephone and injected politely, but pointedly, "Persephone, why are you going to pay twice the working wage for teachers? What's the point?" Persephone shrugged carelessly and answered calmly, "I want to hire the best." Her mother questioned, "Persephone, what will the other schools do?" Persephone shrugged again, "I don't care. That's not my problem. I want to put the bad ones out of business. That's the whole point. I only need about 30 of the middle upper floors for classrooms. That leaves me about 40 floors at the top for observation and study rooms, and I can use the 36 warehouse floors as indoor sports fields. I'll still have about 200 floors left over for landing and tram docks, dining rooms, play areas, locker rooms, restrooms, and administrative areas. I could probably even set up a dormitory eventually for long distance or children who need the lodging for some reason, but I'm not planning on doing that right now." Philip fired at Persephone. His jaw had been working against his growing rage and irritation while she reasoned out loud. "What do you mean you don't care if you put our school system out of business?" The irate daughter snapped back, "That's not what I said at all. I said I wanted to put the bad corporate schools out of business, not the empire's system out of business. It's the hegemony system that will ultimately pay for the education in the first place. I want to put the bad corporate schools out of business. I only want those corporate slugs to shuttle my students because I don't want to maintain that large a fleet of vehicles. So stop twisting my words because you're losing the argument." Philip fumed, "Girl, I'm not losing. You are out of your damn mind. You can't make this work in a million years." Persephone fired back calmly but defiantly with every enunciated syllable, "Yes, I can." He confronted her again, "No, you can't. You don't even have a building that you can rent that much space from." She snapped, repeating herself to goad him, "I never said I was going to rent space. Stop twisting my words because you're losing our argument." Philip's hand slammed to the table. "Damn it, Persephone Apollonia Kroinos. I'm not twisting your words. You're making no sense." She fired back, "It's simple. I'm not going to rent the space from anyone else because I already bought it." Samson inadvertently groaned into his palm at the mention of his participation. That simultaneously drew gazes from everyone seated at the table, including Persephone's withering scowl and Philip's attention. The CEO of the hegemony demanded, "Samson, what in Hade's name did she do?" Samson shook his head with his lips pinched shut and kept his hand over his eyes, steadfastly refusing to speak. He realized too late that under his boss's glare, it had to look like an extremely childish gesture in front of everyone at the table. Persephone snapped at her father, "Leave him out of this. I said I already bought it. But you're not paying attention to anything I'm telling you, so you must have missed that part where I spelled it out in plain English." Philip snapped back, "How did you buy a building?" Persephone's rolling eyes and mocking reply carried so much childish sarcasm that Tommy's teenage girls found highly amusing. "With credits? How else would I buy anything? I'm not going to use seashells and pretty beads or needlework to buy a 350-story building, now am I?" Supremely frustrated, Philip demanded, "What did Samson have to do with this?" Persephone shouted back into his face, "Nothing." Samson raised a finger, pausing things for a moment, and answered more honestly, "Persephone asked me to locate a few buildings in the economically blighted areas near the center of the city. Her criteria were that they were in decent repair along major traffic lines and subject to ownership by holding corporations in distress." Quoting his assistant, "Thanks to the recent economic downturn, and because of fears of the hegemony's stability, There have been some decent properties that had been owned by poorly managed investment groups or corporations that have since gone bankrupt. There were a number of them vacant and/or in receivership that fit the criteria. The purchase was at a remarkably good price because of the distress of the holding company. Philip looked stunned between Selene, Samson, and Persephone. Philip's mouth worked a few times, looking for the words, before he demanded of Samson, "Why in the black depths of space would you do something like that?" Samson was taken aback by the relative insanity of the question, but calmly answered, "Because Persephone asked me to." Samson realized that Philip had not taken a breath, and the vein in the side of his head was pulsing angrily. Tomy's and Abigail's oldest daughter, Sophia, had just turned 17 and asked politely, "Persephone, how are you going to get 100,000 students to go to your school? Isn't that an awful lot of students?" Persephone smiled back, "Well, that's the point. Right now, they are all scattered around hundreds of thousands of different small schools from elementary to high school, spread out over the 250,000 square kilometers of our city. I want to eliminate all those extra administrators, give the teachers a lot more autonomy, and make the schools so good that students are asking to go there." Philip scoffed with derisive mirth. "Kids wanting to go to school. That'll be the day. We have so many truants in the system now that we can hardly keep track of them, Persephone. The students they spit out of that system can hardly read half the time. What makes you think that you can get those same kids to show up to your school as opposed to wherever they go when they are supposed to be at school or studying now?" Persephone practically growled back at her father as she hammered through the list, which she assumed would be obvious by now. Better teachers, better facilities, better food, sports and athletic programs, extracurricular activities and classrooms, libraries and study halls with windows. Tommy scoffed this time, injecting conventional logic into her scheme. "Persephone, nobody puts anything but luxury apartments and high-end shops at the tops of buildings. It's just too stupid to give up that kind of profit center when you can rent out those areas to high-paying customers." Persephone looked into the unexpected assault on her plan. She stared at Tomies, mouth agape at what she obviously thought was his sudden gross stupidity. She snapped sarcastically, "Since there is no one in the vacant building paying rent now, and roaches and squatters don't pay much for the view, there's no rent coming in now, is there? They do nothing but poop on everything. The building hasn't got anyone who's paying to complain about missing the pretty views. Now does it?" Tomy's girls giggled at the crass rebuttal to their precisely metered father's pragmatic business approach to the issues. Even Abigail turned away from him slightly to scratch an imaginary something from her eye as she pretended not to smile. Tomy's youngest, 14-year-old Neola, must have thought no one could hear anything she said as the youngest person at the table full of adults. She said quietly, but not quietly enough around her water glass, "I wish my school had a window." Persephone took the fuel the girl had added to the fire and sarcastically slammed Tomy's. "And how much do you pay every year for Neola's school?" Tommy scowled playfully down the table, past his wife and two giggling oldest daughters, to his now sheepishly smiling youngest. "Apparently not enough for a window. But she's taking languages and has sports and activities available, and the average test scores from the school are exceptional." Persephone snapped, "Good." Persephone then nodded sagely, "Because my school is going to have all top-flight academics, including math, science, geology, history, literature, space navigation and scientific studies, and English. Along with the standard academics, I'm setting up language familiarization requirements for all the major settlement blocks, including Spanish with Portuguese, German, French, Russian, Chinese, and Japanese in the first years, and 2 foreign language requirements to graduate." I'm going to make it the finest school in the whole body of the hegemony's incorporated empire and raise the standard for the empire's educational system. Philip's ever-present guardsman, who stood as security outside the closed door and scattered through the room, remained generally silent. The eccentric battle-scarred major, who captained Philip's guardsman squad, while picking his nails from his corner to Philip's far right, mumbled quietly to himself in the silence, "I'd fail out since they don't plan on offering slang and profanity." Samson cringed at his buddy's comment. Unfortunately for the major, the room was silent enough for him to be heard. Persephone huffed at him, while 15-year-old Bridget and Neola giggled happily in the presence of the all-too-serious adults. Philip Kroinos tried to pin the major to the wall with a hard look, but the major, realizing he had been heard, looked up and shrugged it off. "Can't fight the truth, sir." Philip grumbled something about sending him to go find the truth of the world peeling potatoes in the kitchens for a month. He rounded on Persephone again. "I still don't think you can make this happen. There is no way you can pull that together." Persephone snapped cheerfully and defiantly at her father, goading him, like she knew he could not resist. "Wanna bet?" Philip snapped slowly and deliberately. "Fine." He leaned over the table, pulling forward all his considerably intimidating presence. "I bet that you, Persephone Apollonia Kroinos, cannot in the first year of operations educate 100,000 students, come anywhere close to your silly curriculum requirements, and that you will never turn a 15% profit on your silly little school." Infuriated by the condescension, Persephone snapped back. "Fine." She steamrolled forward, snapping addendums to her father's dictate. "No interference from you or any of your proxies. Pure market conditions will determine success or failure. Construction and organization will take some time, so the first full school year is the benchmark. Long-term goals like dual foreign language proficiency will not be requirements immediately because they will take time to catch up, and it's impossible to teach 12 years of schooling in 1 year. Market rates on education subsidies paid on time and in full, all paid to hegemony standards." She finished and snapped challengingly, "I'll still have the best damn publicly funded general education school the Empire has ever seen." Philip scoffed at the claims. "Fine, I'll give you a weaseled out pass on your language goal for the first year. We're going to do a single wager pot paid to the winning parties, equal wager to enter the betting pool." Philip sneered. "What's the wager?" Persephone sat still for a second before snapping forward in her seat and blurting, 50 credits. Philip fell back in his seat in shock. "What? Why would we wager such a pathetically small amount?" "Put some meat on that offering girl," he mocked. "You need to have some skin in this game." Persephone's eyes changed from confrontational to fury. Samson leaned all the way to his left, supporting his cheek in his palm, while getting as far away from the coming explosion as he could politely manage without leaving his seat. When her response came, it was toneless, level, and cold. 50 credits because that's how much I'm going to pay the teachers per day. I'm going to pay my teachers 3 times what is needed to live a comfortable lifestyle in our city. The wager will be 50 credits in single paper notes. When you lose horribly, you will have to count out every single one of them for me, one by one. You will know the full depths of your failure because every single note will be a reminder to you that I paid twice the going wage for all my teachers, administrators, and managers. As you count them for me, every single one of those wrinkly little paper bills will be like a shred of your excessive pride that you are shaving off and handing over to me." Philip's jaw hung slack. Celine stared wide-eyed with her hand pressed securely over her mouth in shock at the virulent nature of Persephone's wager. Tomes defied her and spoke first. "I'll take a piece of that action. I say you can't do it." Persephone nodded to him while only glancing sidelong at him from the corner of her eye as she stared down her father. Persephone's mother was the next to recover. She dropped her hand to play with the other in her lap for a moment. "Dear, it is a very ambitious plan. I know how fond you are of solid education for young people, and I share much of your passion for the subject. You know that, dear. However, in all honesty, 15% is nearly impossible in this or any market. There has to be something wrong with your math or business plan somewhere to find a profit margin like that. There simply isn't any monopoly or niche in our chaotically free market system that can support your ambitions. I am a stalwart fan of what you're trying. I just think it is too idealistic and unreasonable. I think I need to wager against you, Persephone. I don't think you can do it." Persephone shrugged indifferently at her mother's doubts and wager. Philip growled, "Persephone, you are going to lose this badly." Persephone shrugged indifferently. "We'll see. I'll take that as you are wagering against me." Samson could see clearly that Persephone did not bother to mention that she'd pre-planned this confrontation and rigged the outcome by removing the substantial costs of lease space from the business model. He didn't like how she was accounting for that as a matter of business math, but she was going to get back her capital contributions for the building and the construction in the first 2 years. Persephone was just not going to charge her school any rent for the space. While everyone else was paying almost 30% of their budget to landlords, she was not charging her school anything to operate in her building. She had been painfully careful about her legalistic wording during her whole wager process. Even when she fumbled and stumbled, she had known those numbers cold when they discussed the project. She was not exactly lying, but had to be playing a set-up bet the way she was goading her father. She looked to Rees. "And you?" The tall man shook his head. "I don't think you can do it. I'm going to have to bet against Persephone." Persephone nodded. "Suit yourself, Rees. I'll take your money like the rest of them." She looked past Samson to Diantha. She asked plainly, "Diantha, what about you?" Diantha smiled sweetly around the table and eased some of the creeping tension. "I think even I can afford 50 credits. I think you can do it. At least, I hope you can. I think it sounds like a positively lovely and wonderful idea." Smug at the support, Persephone chirped, "Thank you, Diantha." Persephone smiled at her new, chronologically older, but junior with the family sister. She poked Samson's right leg with her left index finger. "You're taking notes and collecting for me if anyone doesn't pay, especially from Daddy Dearest." Samson was not surprised by his nomination as the wager's secretary, treasurer, and collections agent, but kept his grumbles to himself. They had already discussed this subject of setting up the school over the last few days. It helped that she saved him from betting against his gut feelings about the project or betting against her in the pool. Samson dutifully recorded who bet and the direction of their wager. Under Persephone's guidance, he worked all the way around the table, following Persephone's insistent prodding of everyone down and around the far side of the table. The mood lightened considerably the more wagers were placed as they worked their way around the table from Persephone's right and farther away from the site of the angry father-daughter exchange that had created the wager in the first place. Some jokes were exchanged in both directions, and Persephone behaved like an exceedingly gracious hostess. She deliberately crafted her moves so that she was upstaging her grumbling father, further sticking it in his craw that she was opposing him. He was however trapped because she started her tiff publicly and then turned it into an evening's entertainment. When Persephone got to Neola, the odds were stacked a little over 6-1 against Persephone's success. When Persephone asked Tommy's and Abigail's youngest girl, she perked up happily and instantly. "Can I play, Mom? It's only 50 credits." I have lots more than that in my allowance." The mother looked from her thrilled child to Persephone and sighed through pinched eyes and pursed lips. While looking back from Persephone to Neola, she sighed again and said, "I suppose you can play, baby. Don't make a habit of gambling, though. It's a bad habit I've been trying to break your father off for many years." Before her mother even finished, the girl shouted, "I think Persephone can do it." Her two older sisters wagered that Persephone would succeed too, either because they believed it or because they didn't want to be upstaged by their youngest sister. Samson recorded the three-sister winning streak. Finally, Persephone asked Abigail, "Well, where do you stand?" Abigail choked on her words for a moment before blushing slightly and pushing a few strands of stray brown hair back from her eyes. "I need to abstain." The unexpected chorus of good-spirited grumbles from the side of the table opposite Philip caused her to blush again. Abigail smiled while she paused before answering. "This is Persephone we're talking about. I don't think anyone can do it. But Persephone has pulled so many miracles out of her bag of tricks that I can't bet against her. But I can't bet for her because I honestly don't think she can do it. I can't be dishonest with my bet. At the same time, it's Persephone." Philip rolled his eyes and huffed with a weird little half-smile. "That's why it's called gambling, Abby. Except in this case, when it's a sure thing that she's going to fail. It's not much of a gamble." Persephone ignored her father and asked over his shoulder, "Major, what do you think?" Surprised to be included, the four guardsmen in the room perked up and started paying more attention to the conversation. The major cradled his heavy assault grouse across his lap with his right hand and scratched behind his head with his left fingers. He answered almost gently, "You won't have the best system in the public education arena. There's only one academy that can meet that accolade." All the guardsmen in the room, Samson and Philip included, knew exactly what the capital A on the Major's academy meant. The Major continued, "I need to vote against the wager because she won't be able to match that standard." Philip looked newly smugly satisfied as his guardsman pointed out a loophole to victory he had not seen before. Samson corrected, "Major, that system is not in the public education system. Persephone stated best in the general public system. The Guardsman Academy is a merit-based, metered admission, privately funded, military academy that is supported and funded by academic scholarships provided by the Hegemony's Executor Corporation and the Ground Forces Corporation. It is not an open enrollment system that compares equitably with what Persephone is proposing." Philip scowled as Samson shredded his newly open and freshly closed loophole to the wager's easy victory. The major stood straighter from the wall, stopped fidgeting, and nodded at the correction. "Understood, High Commander Rockpoint. I still think it's a long shot. I think that the odds are closer to 10-1, and the payout right now is only about 6-1. I don't think the payoff justifies the odds just yet. I need to go against it." Samson recorded the major's wager and the three remaining guardsmen in the room when they each placed their wagers. He closed the betting in the room, knowing full well that he would need to entertain at least a dozen more guardsmen wagers. He knew that he would have 2 from Persephone's contingent, Tomi's 2, Philip's 4 who were outside the door, and the rest assigned to the diners in the secured room who were not present because they were on their own meal rotations. Guardsmen were notorious gamblers. Samson didn't indulge too heavily, but some of their ranks were constantly placing wagers. He read somewhere in some fuzzy study sociological babble hit piece that the behavior was attributed to excessive campaign dividends, exorbitant wages, and an unhealthy enjoyment of risky activities. Samson thought that was a bunk. They weren't paid enough for the decade and a half of training, what they did in the field, the casualties they took. or the tedious hours holding society wife-dog leashes on contract guard assignments. Suddenly Persephone stood. She glanced along the table and winked at the three girls across from her. The three girls now thought she was the coolest adult in the world. She calmly proclaimed, "If you will all excuse me, I have some work I need to attend to this evening." While Samson was looking up at her, she turned to leave and lovingly dragged the back of her right hand along his cheek before pressing him back into his seat and stepping purposefully to the door. She scuffled with the guardsman briefly while the doors were still open behind her, about sending only one of them with her, and sending her own permanently assigned guardsman after her when they finished their meal, since they would report to the dining room first looking for her. The rest of their exchange was cut off when the doors slipped shut. For Samson, the room became cold and boring with Persephone gone. They still had some moderate formalities to tend to before the evening ended. He retabulated the wagers and shook his head at the solid 6-1 odds against Persephone. Persephone was of course the only one in the room who could wander out during the evening without causing a political flap or a loss of employment. She was the only one with enough personal weight within the family that she could do it without repercussions for her career or standing. If anyone remaining in the room tried that, either Selene would have had their head or Philip would have fired them if Tomes didn't beat him to it. Samson envied her sometimes. Not only were things boring, but Lord Kroinos was less than happy the remainder of the evening, thanks to the verbal battering he had taken at the hands of Persephone. Samson wanted to chuckle at the brief memory of an earlier conversation. She was the daughter that he had told Samson would be out of his hair no more than 3 months ago, in his office when he told Samson that he and Persephone were as good as married anyway. That statement was surely coming back to publicly bite the corporate empire's CEO in the center of his face and pride. When things finally broke up and the formality of the evening was crumbling into more freewheeling socializing, Samson heard sprightly Neola ask the horribly burn-scared major, "Why do guardsmen never eat dinner?" She scoffed at his dogmatic, "We don't eat. We consume all of our vital amino acids and vitamins directly from the air. We are completely self-sustaining based on the air we breathe." Samson was shaking his head at the standard line and working his way to the door to catch up with Persephone when he was gently interrupted by Rhee's hand under his elbow. The tall middle-aged soldier was experienced enough with guardsmen in general that he knew much better than to surprise them with violent or abrupt gestures in their peripheral vision or slapping into their bodies. The volatile and often violent nature of their decades of training and combat-conditioned responses was not healthy to provoke. In addition to the standard caution when dealing with guardsmen, Rhees approached Samson with a very cautious and level perspective. Samson was considered married to the woman Rhees was contracted to before the transfer of that arrangement to Diantha. If the rumor was correct, that was in no small part thanks to Samson himself, allowing all parties to save their honor, and interestingly enough, find a degree of happiness, and both men knew it. Rhees had also seen all of Samson's video-recorded exploits, both live and later in agonizing, often magnified, detail as he and every officer in the military establishment had enlisted themselves looking for clues about the identities of the attackers. Many were just looking for some way to support Persephone and Samson while they fought to stay alive against the unknown and nearly invisible conspiracy before the plot exploded publicly on that live Friday evening docudrama. Rhees treated Samson very delicately, with the fear and reverence accorded to the hegemony's first warrior, and the caution of someone who had once, unknowingly, stood directly between that warrior and the woman he loved. Rhees was an extremely talented, tall, gregarious, and popular commander of the hegemony's ground forces. He came up through the ranks in some of the most brutal fighting of the Genesis Wars only a few years after Philip Kroinos and Tomies Promethean entered service. He had continued as a soldier long after they'd left and started their successful civilian careers. He was largely credited with turning the tide of initial losses and setbacks suffered by the first two generations of the Kroinos hegemony after their ascension to power. He orchestrated a stunning string of victories early in his command with boldly audacious maneuvers, followed by a deliberate and ruthless occupation and consolidation of territory once the borders had stabilized. He had worked so well with the fleet that in a series of sweeping three-dimensional thrusts and churning offensives he had architected initially the recapture and later expansion of territory through capture of enemy constellations along multiple fronts. Samson actually credited the man's unflinching loyalty and supreme strategic and tactical genius single-handedly with the survival and success of the third generation of the Kroinos hegemony. The man was a superb commander and confident tactician. Samson had grown up and spent all his adult life fighting in successful campaigns designed by this man. His personal survival in those campaigns was a direct result of Rhee's meticulous attention to detail and preparation. Samson's personal fortune and wealth from campaign mineral rights and spoils was a direct result of his judicious and efficient use of personnel and selection of profitable targets. He would often, through military maneuver or sleight of hand, make a campaign untenable for opposing forces even before hegemony troops landed, resulting in inexpensive victories over profitable target systems. There were few things troops liked more than conquest campaign mineral rights, paid in full, from a system that surrendered without a shot fired. Rhee's caution made Samson feel awkward. Rhees was one of Samson's personal heroes. Rhees cautiously and quietly pulled Samson's attention after the dinner Persephone's project and subsequent betting fireworks had ended. He gently asked, "How can you deal with her when she's like that?" Samson was decidedly uncomfortable with Rhee's change in demeanor around him. It was like the man was struggling not to break the eggshells he was walking on every time he approached Samson. Samson hated it. He always felt like he was lying to a man he viewed with all the respect he could muster. Not only was Rhees a much senior soldier, experience and command scope-wise, but Rhees was the Empire's large operations subject matter expert on so many fronts that Samson was desperately in need of the man's mentorship. Rhees treated Samson with something near deference. Samson never considered the matrimonial contract that he had breached between Rhees and Persephone. It rankled every scrap of honor he should have had whenever he thought about his self-serving and selfish acts that had led him to Persephone's side. He would do it all over again in a heartbeat, but still it all made Samson very uncomfortable around Rhees. Samson shook his head with fatigue as the tension from the evening washed over him like he was drowning in it. Samson just started babbling his frustrations without really thinking. It was like Rhees had struck the stopper from a keg as Samson started to spill words onto the floor. Rhee's Persephone is like a force of nature when she gets into this type of mood. You don't deal with her. If you want to survive the storm, you either go along with her and support her, or you try to weather the hurricane in place and clean up after the storm has passed. Samson pinched the bridge of his nose with fingers from his left hand, while his right hung uselessly between the two men in a forgotten gesture. Samson wanted to do something useful with that hand, like close it around an assault rifle or pistol grip. That was at least something he knew, understood, and could manage. Samson was feeling significantly out of his depth now. He was still a chronologically junior guardsman who had accelerated beyond his peer group by chance and by overloading his resume with brutal ground side combat campaigns on extremely wealthy worlds. Those few horrific but profitable campaigns, where substantial casualty rates prompted promotions, came quickly for him, since he survived those meat-grinding campaigns while climbing to higher levels of responsibility over the bodies of the senior Guardsman casualties. He had fallen to disgrace, worked as a private detective's probationary recruit, and from that lowly anonymous station had catapulted all the way past his prior ground forces-based rank of sub-colonel by 5 grades and into the ranks of general officers. He was now a military corporation vice president, and still feeling more than overwhelmed. Rees marveled. "I don't think I could have dealt with that. I think she would have made me nuts, certifiably insane." Samson pushed both his hands through his short hair as he stumbled forward and out of the dining room with Rees. "Persephone can be a handful." The stress of the evening was bleeding through to be shown in such a blatant tell. Rees spoke into Samson's dismay. "Well, you two are good for, and I should also say with each other. She is definitely too much of a firecracker for my tastes." Samson looked back into the room at the happily animated redhead Diantha, chatted amiably with Tommy's daughters about how they were all going to take their father's money in their wager. Tommy's would periodically shake his head at the female harassment. Celine leaned soothingly against Philip, who was still smarting from his daughter's public rebellion, as they entertained a conversation with their subordinate COs. Samson quirked a smile at Rees before speaking quietly. "Diantha is a good woman. I'm glad that she's now a closer part of the family. She seems happier with the prospect of you now than she has in years. I've known her for a long time, but this is the happiest I've ever seen her. I'm not sure I've ever really known her with the shells she'd kept up before. I'm glad you two have hit it off." He almost said something about how Diantha had a lot of rough years under the abusive hand of Casimir, and that she was healing well, but choked it off. Instead, Samson smiled again and replaced the dour comment with a joking, "Besides, she's too tall for me." Rees cracked into his normal gregarious self by barking a laugh back into the room that caused many people around the room to look back at him and smile, pretending to be part of the joke too, because they didn't want people to think they were in the out crowd. Rees clapped Samson on the back, knocking Samson forward half a step, and dropped back to a pleasantly conspiratorial tone. "I guess that suits me just fine. I suppose I'm a little too tall for Persephone too, so I think everything may work out well in the end."
Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate your listening. When you get a chance, please come and hit the like, subscribe, leave a comment, and check out the book for real down in the description.